Let them return unto thee, but return not thou unto them. And I will make thee unto this people a fenced, brazen wall. And they shall fight against thee, but they shall not prevail against thee, for I am with thee to save thee and to deliver thee, saith the Lord. Jeremiah 15:19 and 20. The words of my text, having a full dependence upon and flowing out from the main subject matter of the whole chapter, I must of necessity take a view of it, and hold out to you the mind of God contained in it, before I enter upon the part of it chiefly intended. And this I shall do with very brief observations, that I may not anticipate myself from a full opening and application of the words of my text. And this the rather are my thoughts led to, because the whole transaction of things between the Lord and a stubbornly sinful nation, exceedingly accommodated to the carrying on of the controversy he is now pleading with that in which we live, is set out, as we say, to the life therein. Of the whole chapter, there are 5 parts. First, the denunciation of fearful, wasting, destroying judgments against Judah and Jerusalem, verse 3, and so on to verse 10. Secondly, the procuring deserving cause of these overwhelming calamities, verses 4 and 6. Thirdly, the inevitableness of these judgments and inexorableness of the Lord as to the accomplishment of all the evils denounced, verse 1. Fourthly, the state and condition of the prophet, with the frame and deportment of his spirit under those bitter dispensations of providence, verses 10 and 15 to 18. Fifthly, the answer and appearance of God to him upon the making out of his complaint, verses 11 to 14 and verses 19 to 21. First, there is a denunciation of fearful, wasting, destroying judgments to sinful Jerusalem, verse 2, and so onwards, with some interposed ejaculations concerning her inevitable ruin. Here death, sword, famine, captivity, banishment, unpitied desolation, redoubled destruction, bereaving, fanning, spoil, and so on, are mentioned in verse 2 to verse 9, that universal devastation of the whole people which came upon them in the Babylonish captivity is the thing here intended, the means of its accomplishment by particular plagues and judgments, and their several kinds, for the greater dread and terror being at large enumerated, the faithfulness of God also being made by this to shine more clear in the dispersion of that people, doing not only for the main what before he had threatened, but in particular executing the judgments recorded, Luke 21:24, fulfilling by this what he had devised, accomplishing the word he had commanded in the days of old, Lamentations 2:17. That which hence I shall observe is only from the variety of these particulars, which are held out as a means of the intended desolation. Observation: God's treasures of wrath against a sinful people have sundry and various issues for the accomplishment of the appointed end. When God walks contrary to a people, it is not always in one path. He has 7 ways to do it, and will do it 7 times, Leviticus 26, verse 24. He strikes not always with one weapon, nor in one place, as there is with him manifold and various grace, 1 Peter 4:10. Love and compassion making out itself in choice variety, suited to our manifold indigencies. So there is, in Romans 2, verse 5, stored, treasured wrath, suiting itself in its flowings out to the provocations of stubborn sinners. The first emblem of God's wrath against man was a flaming sword turning itself every way, Genesis 3:24. Not only in one or two, but in all their paths, he meets them with his flaming sword, as a wild beast in a net. So are sinners under inexorable judgments. The more they strive, the more they are enwrapped and entangled. They shuffle themselves from under one calamity and fall into another, as if a man did flee from a lion, and a bear met him, or went into the house and leaned his hand on the wall, and a serpent bit him. Amos 5:19. Oh, remove this one plague, saith Pharaoh. If he can escape from under this pressure, he thinks he shall be free. But when he fled from the lion, still the bear met him. The flaming sword turns every way, so God can put it into everything. To those that cry, give me a king, God can give him in his anger. And from those that cry, take him away, he can take away in his wrath. Hosea 13:10 and 11. Oh, that this might seal up instruction to our own souls. What variety of calamities have we been exercised with for a number of years? What Pharaoh-like spirits have we had under them? Oh, that we were delivered this once, and then all were well. How do we spend all our thoughts to extricate ourselves from our present pressures? If this hedge, this pit were passed, we should have smooth ground to walk on, not considering that God can fill our safest paths with snares and serpents. Give us peace, give us wealth, give us as we were with our own, in quietness. Poor creatures, suppose all these desires were in sincerity, and not as with the most they are, fair colors of foul and bloody designs. Yet if peace were, and wealth were, and former things were, and God were not, what would it avail you? Cannot he poison your peace and canker your wealth? And when you were escaped out of the field from the lion and the bear, could he not appoint a serpent to bite you, leaning upon the walls of your own house? In vain do you seek to stop the streams while the fountains are open. Turn yourselves wherever you will. Bring yourselves into what condition you can. Nothing but peace and reconciliation with the God of all these judgments can give you rest in a day of visitation. You see what variety of plagues are in his hand. Changing of condition will do no more to the avoiding of them than a sick man's turning himself from one side of the bed to another. During his turning, he forgets his pain by striving to move. Being laid down again, he finds his condition the same as before. This is the first thing. We are under various judgments, from which by ourselves there is no deliverance. Secondly, the second thing here expressed is the procuring cause of these various judgments set down, verse 4. Because of Manasseh, son of Hezekiah, king of Judah, for that which he did in Jerusalem. The sins of Manasseh filled the ephah of Judah's wickedness, and caused the talent of lead to be laid on the mouth of it. Oftentimes in the relation of a story does the Holy Ghost emphatically express this, that for his sin Judah should be destroyed, 2 Kings 21 verse 11. Yea, when they had a little reviving under Josiah, and the bowels of the Lord began to work in compassion towards them, yet, as it were remembering the provocation of this Manasseh, he recalls his thoughts of mercy, 2 Kings 23 verses 26 and 27. The deposing of divine and human things is oftentimes very opposite. God himself proceeds with them in a diverse dispensation. In his spiritual body the members offend, and the head is punished. The iniquity of us all did meet on him, Isaiah 53 verse 1. In the civil politic body the head offends, and the members rue it. Manasseh sins, and Judah must go captive. Three things present themselves for the vindication of the equity of God's righteous judgments and the recompensing the sins of the king upon the people. Number 1, the concurrence and influence of the people's power into their rule and government. They that set him up may justly be called to answer for his miscarriage. The Lord himself had before made the sole bottom of that political administration to be their own wills. If you will have a king, after the manner of the nations, Deuteronomy 17 verse 14, 1 Samuel 8 verse 7, though for particulars himself, according to his supreme sovereignty, placed in many, appointed many of the kings by peculiar exemption, otherwise his providence was served by their plenary consent, or by such dispensation of things as you have related, 1 Kings 16, 21 and 22. Then were the people of Israel divided into two parts. Half of the people followed Tibni, the son of Ginath, to make him king, and half followed Omri. But the people that followed Omri prevailed against the people that followed Tibni, so Tibni died, and Omri reigned. Now they who place men in authority to be God's vice-regents do undertake to God for their deportment in that authority, and therefore may justly bear the sad effects of their sinful miscarriages. Number 2, because for fear of Manasseh's cruelty, or to flatter him in his tyranny for their advantage, the greatest part of the people had apostatized from the ways and worship of Hezekiah to comply with him in his sin, as at another time they willingly walked after the commandment. Hosea 5, verse 11. And this is plainly expressed in 2 Kings 21:9. Manasseh seduced the people to do more evil than the nations. When kings turn seducers, they seldom lack good store of followers. Now if the blind lead the blind, both will, and both justly may, fall into the ditch. When kings command unrighteous things, and people suit them with willing compliance, none doubts but the destruction of them both is just and righteous. Number 3, because the people, by virtue of their retained sovereignty, did not restrain him in his provoking ways. So says Zwingli in Article 42. When Saul would have put Jonathan to death, the people would not allow him to do so, but deliver Jonathan, that he died not. 1 Samuel 14:45. David proposed a reducing of the ark. His speech to the people was, "If it seem good to you, let us send abroad to our brethren everywhere, that they may gather themselves to us." And all the congregation said that they would do so, because the thing was right in the eyes of all the people. 1 Chronicles 13:2 and 4. So they bargained with Rehoboam about their subjection upon condition of a moderate rule. 1 Kings 12. By virtue of which power also they delivered Jeremiah from the prophets and priests that would have him put to death. Jeremiah 26:16. And on this ground might they justly feed on the fruit of their own neglected duty. Be it thus or otherwise, by what way soever the people had their interest in it, certain it is that for the sins of Manasseh, one way or other, made their own, they were destroyed. And therefore, these things being written for our example, it cannot but be of a great concern to us to know what were those sins which wrapped up the people of God in irrevocable destruction. Now these the Holy Ghost fully manifests in the story of the life and reign of this Manasseh, that they may be reduced to 2 chief heads. 1, false worship or superstition. He built high places, made altars for Baal and a grove, as did Ahab. 2 Kings 21:3. Number 2, cruelty. He shed innocent blood very much, till he had filled Jerusalem with blood from one end of it to another. Verse 16. Whether this cruelty be to be ascribed to his tyranny in civil affairs, and so the blood shed is called innocent because not of malefactors, or to his persecution and subordination to his false worship, instituted as before, as the Pope and his adherents have devoured whole nations, is not apparent, but this is from hence and other places most evident. Superstition and persecution, will worship and tyranny are inseparable concomitants. Nebuchadnezzar sets up his great image, and the next news you hear, the saints are in the furnace. Daniel 3, verse 20. You seldom see a fabric of human invented worship, but either the foundation or topstone is laid in the blood of God's people. The wisdom, religion, or way of worship that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. James 3, verse 17. When the other is earthly, sensual, devilish, bringing along envying, strife, confusion, and every evil work. Verse 16. Persecution and blood is a genuine product of all invented worship. I might from this name and pursue other observations, but I shall only name one, and then proceed. Observation. When false worship, with injustice by cruelty, have possessed the governors of a nation, and wrapped in the consent of the greatest part of the people who have been acquainted with the mind of God, that people and nation without unprecedented mercy is obnoxious to remediless ruin. Those two are the Baal and dragon, that, what by their actings, what by their deservings has swallowed that ocean of blood which has flowed from the veins of millions slain upon the face of the earth. Give me the number of the witnesses of Jesus whose souls under the altar cry for revenge against their false worshipping murderers, and to tell of them, whose lives have been sacrificed to the insatiable ambition and tyranny of bloodthirsty potentates, with the issues of God's just vengeance on the sons of men for compliance in these two things, and you will have gathered in the whole harvest of blood, leaving but a few straggling gleanings upon other occasions. And if these things have been found in England in the present administration, with sincere humiliation do not run across to unravel this close-woven web of destruction, all thoughts of recovery will quickly be too late. And thus far sin and providence drive on a parallel. Thirdly, the inevitableness of the desolation threatened and inexorableness of God in the execution of it, verse 1, is the third thing considerable. Though Moses and Samuel stood before me, yet my mind could not be toward this people. Should I insist upon this, it would draw me out unto Scripture evidences of a nation's traveling in sin beyond the line of God's patience, and so not to be exempted from ruin, but instead of it, I shall make it a part of my daily supplications that they may be to our enemies, if God's enemies, and the interpretation of them to those that hate us. In brief, the words contain an impossible supposition and yet a negation of the thing for whose sake it is supposed. Moses and Samuel were men who in the days of their flesh offered up strong supplications and averted many imminent judgments from a sinful people. As if the Lord should say, all that I can do in such a case as this, I would grant at the intercession of Moses and Samuel, or others interceding in their spirit and zeal. But now the state of things has come to that pass, the time of treaty being expired, the black flag hung out, and the decree having brought forth, Zephaniah 2:2, that upon their utmost entreaty it shall not be reversed. Observation. There is a time when sin grows ripe for ruin. For 3 transgressions and for 4 the Lord will not turn away the iniquity of a people, Amos 1:9. When the sin of the Amorites has filled a cup of vengeance, they must drink it. Genesis 15 verse 16, England, under several administrations of civil government, has fallen twice, yea thrice, into nation-destroying sins. Providence has once more given it another bottom, if you should stumble, which the Lord avert, at the same block of impiety and cruelty. There is not another sifting to be made to reserve any grains from the ground. I doubt not but our 3 transgressions and 4 will end in total desolation. The Lord be your guide. Poor England lies at stake. Observation. The greatest difficulty that lies in bringing of total destruction upon a sinful people is the interposition of Moses and Samuel. If Moses would but have stood out of the gap and let the Almighty go, he had broken in upon the whole host of Israel, Exodus 32 verses 9 and 10, and let it by the way be observed of the spirit of Samuel, that when the people of God were most exorbitant, he cries, as for me, God forbid that I should sin against the Lord in ceasing to pray for you, 1 Samuel 12:23, scarce answered by those who, if their interests be not served, or at least their reason satisfied, will scarce yield a prayer for, yea, pour out curses against their choicest deliverers. The Lord lay it not to their charge. For us, seeing that praying deliverers are more prevalent than fighting deliverers, it is, though Moses and Samuel, not Gideon and Samson, stood before me, as some decay, let us gather strength in the Lord, that he may have never the more rest for their giving over until he establishes Mount Zion, a praise in the earth. Fourthly, Coming now to the fourth thing in this chapter, the prophet's state and condition, with the frame and deportment of his heart and spirit under these dispensations, and here we find him expressing two things of himself. 1, what he found from others, verse 10. 2, what he wrestled with in his own spirit, verses 15 to 18. What he found from others, he tells you, it was cursing and reproach and so on. I have neither lent on usury, nor have men lent to me on usury, yet every one of them curses me, verse 10. Now this return may be considered two ways. First, in itself, every one, he says, of this people curses me. Number 2, in reference to his deportment, I have neither borrowed nor lent on usury, yet they curse me. From the first, observe, instruments of God's greatest works and glory are oftentimes the chiefest objects of a professing people's cursings and revenges. The return which God's laborers meet with in this generation is in the number of those things in which there is none new under the sun. Men that, under God, deliver a kingdom may have the kingdom's curses for their pains. Moses had brought the people of Israel out of bondage by that wonderful and unparalleled deliverance, being forced to appear with the Lord for the destruction of Korah and his associates, who would have seduced a congregation to its utter ruin. He receives at length this reward of all his travail, labor, and pains. All the congregation gathered themselves against him, and Aaron, laying murder and sedition to their charge, telling them they had killed the people of the Lord. A goodly reward for all their travails. Numbers 16, 41 and 42. If God's works do not suit with the lusts, prejudices, and interests of men, they will labor to give his instruments the devil's wages. Let not upright hearts sink because they meet with thankless men. A man may have the blessing of God and the curse of a professing people at the same time. Behold, I and the children whom God has given me are for signs and for wonders in Israel. Isaiah 8:18. Man's condemnation and God's absolution do not seldom meet upon the same persons for the same things. If you labor to do the work of the Lord, pray, think it not strange, if among men curses be your reward and detestation your wages. Number 2, in reference to the prophet's deportment, he had neither lent nor had any lent to him upon usury. He was free from blame among them. He had no dealings with them in those things which are usually attended with reproaches, as he shows by an example in usury, a thing that a long time has heard very ill. Observation. Men, every way blameless, and to be embraced in their own ways, are oftentimes abhorred and laden with curses for following the Lord in his ways. What precious men should many be, would they let go of the work of God in this generation? No advantage against them but in the matter of their God, and that is enough to have them to the lions, Daniel 6:5. He that might be honored for compassing the ends, suiting his own worldly interest, and will cheerfully undergo dishonor for going beyond to suit the design of God, has surely some impression upon his spirit that is from above. Number 2, you have the prophet's deportment and the frame of his spirit during those transactions between the Lord and that sinful people, and this he holds out in many pathetical complaints, to be fainting, decaying, perplexed, weary of his burden, not knowing how to ease himself, as you may see at large, verses 15 to 18. Observation. In dark and difficult dispensations of providence, God's choicest servants are oftentimes ready to faint under the burden of them. How weary was David when he cried out in such a condition, "Oh, that I had wings like a dove, for then would I fly away and be at rest." Psalm 55:6. Long had he waited for a desired issue of his perplexed state, and perhaps oftentimes been frustrated of his hope of drawing to a period of his miseries. And now, finding one disappointment to follow on the neck of another, he is weary and cries, "What? Nothing but this trouble and confusion still? Oh, that I had wings like a dove, a ship to sail to a foreign nation, or the like." there to be at peace. And alike straight another time. See what a miserable conclusion he draws of all his being exercised under the hand of God. Psalm 72, verse 13. Verily, I've cleansed my heart in vain, and washed my hands in innocency. And again, in Psalm 116, verse 11, he says in the perturbation of his mind, all men are liars, that all the promises, all the encouragements which in his way he had received from God should fail of their accomplishment. It is not with them as it was with that wicked king of Israel, who being disappointed of peace and deliverance in his own time cries out, This evil is of the Lord. What, should I wait for the Lord any longer? 2 Kings 6:33. The season of deliverance suited not his expectation, therefore he quite throws off the Lord and his protection. Not unlike many among ourselves, whose desires and expectations, being not satisfied in the closing of our distractions, according to the way which themselves had framed for the Lord to walk in, are ready to cast off his cause, his protection, to comply with the enemies of his name. But it may be observed that deliverance came not to that people until Jehoram was weary of waiting, and then instantly God gives it in. When God has tired the patience of corrupted men, he will speak peace to them that wait for him. Thus it is not with the saints of God only, being perplexed in their spirits, dark in their apprehensions, and fainting in their strength. They break out oft times into passionate complaints, as Jeremiah for a cottage in the wilderness, but yet for the main holding firm to the Lord. And the reasons of this quelling are, first, a weakness of faith, when the methods of God's proceedings are unfathomable to our apprehensions, and see the paths in which the Lord walks. They can follow him through some difficulties, but when that is hid from them, though providence so shut up all other ways that it is impossible God should be in them, yet if they cannot discern, so proud are they, how he goes in that in which he is, they are ready to faint and give over. God is pleased sometimes to make darkness his pavilion and his secret place. A fire devours before him, and it is very tempestuous round about him. Psalm 50, verse 3. When once God is attended with fire, darkness, and tempest, because we cannot so easily see him, we are ready to leave him. Now this the Lord usually does in the execution of his judgments. Your righteousness is like the great mountains, your judgments are a great deep. Psalm 36, verse 6. His righteousness, his kindness is like a great mountain that is easy to be seen. A man cannot overlook it, unless he willfully shut his eyes, but his judgments are like the great deep. Who can look into the bottom of the sea, or know what is done in the depths of it? God's works and their accomplishment are oftentimes so unsuited to the reasons and apprehensions of men, that very many who have been strong in their desires, and great in expectation of them, upon their bringing forth to light, have quite rejected and opposed them as none of his, because distant from what they had framed to themselves. It is evident from the gospel that the people of the Jews were full of expectation and longing for the great work of the coming of the Messiah, just at the season in which he came. Yet when he came, because it was not accommodated to their pre-imaginations, they rejected him, as having neither form nor comeliness in him to be desired. Isaiah 53, verse 2. And the prophet Amos tells many who desired the day of the Lord, that that day should be darkness to them and not light. Amos 5, verses 18 to 20. So in every generation many desirous of the accomplishment of God's work are shaken off from any share in it, by finding it unsuited to their reasons and expectations. Now when the Lord is pleased thus to walk in darkness, many not being able to trace him in his dispensations are ready to lie down and sink under the burden. David seems to profess that he had nothing at such a time to uphold him but this, that God must be there or nowhere. He says, I had said that it was in vain to walk as I do, but that I should have condemned the generation of your children. Psalm 73, verse 15. And truly God never leaves us without so much light, but we may see clearly where he isn't. And so by recounting particulars, we may be rolled where he is, though his goings there be not so clear. Ask if God be in the counsels of men who seek themselves, and in the ways of those who make it their design to ruin the generation of the just. If you find him there, seek no further. If not, let that give you light to discern where he makes his abode, that you turn not aside to the flocks of others. Number 2, a reducing the works of providence to inbred rules of their own, but this I cannot pursue. So be tender towards those who faint in difficult seasons. If they leave waiting on the Lord because the evil is of him, if they cast in their lot with the portion of the ungodly, they will in the end perish in their gainsaying. But as for such, for lack of light, what? For lack of faith, sit down and sigh in darkness. Be not too hasty in laying further burdens on them. When first a confederacy was entered into by the Protestant princes in Germany against Charles V, Luther himself for a season was bewildered and didn't know what to do, until being instructed in the fundamental laws of the empire, he sat down fully in that undertaking, even though the Lord did not give the desired request. Our Savior Christ asks if when he comes he shall find faith on the earth. Luke 18:8. It is his coming with the spirit of judgment and burning, a day of trial and visitation, he there speaks of. Now what faith shall he lack, which will not be found in that day? Not the faith of adherence to himself for spiritual life and justification, but of actual closing with him in the things he then does, that shall be rare. Many shall be staggered and faint in that day. And thus, by the several heads of this chapter, have I led you through the very state and condition of this nation at this time. First, variety of judgments are threatened to us, and incumbent on us, as in the first part. Secondly, of these, false worship, superstition, tyranny, and cruelty lie in the bottom as their procuring causes, which is the second. Thirdly, these, if renewed under your hand, will certainly bring inevitable ruin upon the whole nation, which is the third. Fourthly, all which make many precious hearts, what for lack of light, what for lack of faith, to fail, and cry out for the wings of a dove, which is the fourth. Fifthly, I come in the fifth place to God's direction to you for the future in the state and condition, which being spread in a number of verses, as the Lord gives it to the prophet, I shall meddle with no more of it than is contained in the words which at our entrance I read to you. Let them return, and so on. In these words, observe 4 things. First, God's direction to the prophet, and in him to all that do his work in such a season as this described. Let them return to you, return not thou to them. Number 2, their assistance and support and pursuance of that direction. I will make you to this people a brazen fenced wall. Number 3, the opposition with its success and issue, which in that way they should meet with. They shall fight against you, but shall not prevail. Fourth, their consolation and success from the presence of the Lord. For I am with you, to deliver you, and so on. First, there is God's direction. Many difficulties in this troublesome season was the prophet intricated with, that people would not be prevailed with to come up to the mind of God. They continuing in their stubbornness. The Lord would not be prevailed with to avert the threatened desolation. What now shall he do? To stand out against the bulk of the people does not suit his earthly interest. To couple with him doesn't answer the discharge of his office. To wait upon them any longer is fruitless. To give up himself to their ways, comfortless. Hence his complaints, hence his moanings. Better to lie down and sink under the burden than always to swim against the stream of an unreformable multitude. In the strait the Lord comes in with his direction. Let them return to you, and so on. Keep your station. Perform your duty. Comply not with the children of backsliding. But whatever be the issue, if there be any closing rot, let it be by working them off from their ways of folly. All condensation on your part, where the work of God is to be done, is in opposition to him. If they return, embrace him freely. If not, do your duty constantly. Plausible compliances of men in authority with those against whom they are employed are treacherous. If God be so provoked that he curses him who does his work negligently, what is he by them that do it treacherously? When he gives a sword into the hands of men, and they thrust it into his own bowels. His glory and honor, though things so dear to him, he that is entrusted with it and dares not do justice on every one that dares do injustice, is afraid of the creature, but makes very bold with the Creator. Proverbs 25:2. It is the glory of God to conceal a thing, but the honor of kings is to search out a matter. That which God aims to be glorious in, to manifest his attributes by, is the concealing and covering our iniquities in Christ. But if the magistrate will have glory, if he will not bring upon himself dishonor by dishonoring God, he is to search and find out the transgressions with whose cognizance he is entrusted, and to give to them condign retribution. If the Lord curse him who come not forth to his help against the mighty, Judges 5:23, what is their due, who being called forth by him do yet help the mighty against him? For a man to take part with the kingdom's enemies is no small crime, but for a commission officer to run from them by whom he is commissionated, to take part with the adversary, is death without mercy. Yet have not some in our days arrived at that stupendous impudence, that when as private persons they have declaimed against the enemies of the nation, and by that means got themselves into authority, they have made use of that authority to comply with and uphold those by an opposition to whom they got into their authority, which is no less than an atheistical attempt to personate the Almighty, to such iniquities as without his appearance they dare not own. But he that justifies the wicked and he that condemns the just, even they both are an abomination to the Lord. Proverbs 17:15. And not only to the Lord, but to good men also. He that saith to the wicked, Thou art righteous, him shall the people curse, nations shall abhor him. Proverbs 24:24. I speak only as to the general. For me, let all particulars find mercy, with the sad remembrance of the late workings of things amongst us, with those vile sordid compliances which grew upon the spirits of magistrates and ministers, with those whose garments were dyed with the blood of God's saints and precious ones, as formerly they were called. For now these names are become terms of reproach. And would that this complying went alone, but pretenses and accusations must be found out against such as follow with them. When they begin to call darkness light, they will ere long call light darkness, by which means our eyes have seen men of their own accord laying down the weapons in which at first they fought against opposers, and taken up them which were used against themselves, as has happened more than once to penmen, both in our own and in our neighbor's nation. Now this revolting from principles of religion and righteousness to a compliance with any sinful way or person is a treacherous opposition to the God of heaven, for it cannot be done but by preferring the creature before the Creator, especially in those things which are the proximate causes of deviation. Two principal causes I have observed of this crooked walking: number one, fear; number two, that desire of perishing things which has a mixture of covetousness and ambition. The first makes men waxy what they do against men. The other makes them weary of doing anything for God, as by this their sordid ends are not like to be accomplished. First, fear. When once magistrates begin to listen after sed sequiturs, and so to withdraw from doing good for fear of suffering evil, paths of wickedness are quickly returned to, and the authority of God despised. Let this man go and take heed of Caesar. John 19:12 did more prevail on Pilate's treacherous heart than all the other clamors of the Jews. Yea, was not the whole Sanhedrim swayed to desperate villainy for fear the Romans should come and take away their kingdom? John 11:48. When men begin once to distrust that God will leave them in the briars, to wrestle it out themselves, for unbelief lies at the bottom of carnal fear, they quickly turn themselves to contrivances of their own for their own safety, their own prosperity, which commonly is by obliging those to them, by compliances and an opposition to whom they might oblige the Almighty to their assistance. They conclude he lacks either truth or power to support them in his employment. From this principle of carnal fear and unbelief, trembling for a man that shall die, and a son of man that shall be as grass, forgetting the Lord our Maker, Isaiah 51:12, are all those prudential follies which exercise the minds of most men in authority, making them, especially in times of difficulties, to regulate and square all their proceedings by what suits their own safety and particular interests, counseling, advising, working for themselves, quite forgetting by whom they are entrusted and whose business they should do. Number 2, a desire of perishing things tempered with covetousness and ambition. Hence was the sparing of the fat cattle and of Agag by Saul, 1 Samuel 15:1. When those two qualifications close on any, they are diametrically opposed to that frame which God requires in them, namely, that they should be men fearing God and hating covetousness. The first will go far, being only a contrivance for safety. But if this latter take hold of any, being a consultation to exalt themselves, it quickly carries them beyond all bounds whatsoever. The Lord grant that hereafter there may be no such complaints in this nation, or that they may be causeless, as have been heretofore, namely, that we have poured out our prayers, jeoparded our lives, wasted our estates, our blood to serve the lusts and compass the designs of ambitious, ungodly men. The many ways in which these things entrench upon the spirits of men to bias them from the paths of the Lord I shall not insist upon. It is enough that I have touched upon the obvious causes of deviation and manifested them to be treacheries against the God of all authority. Application. Be exhorted to beware of relapses, with all their causes and inducements, and to be constant to the way of righteousness. This I shall hold out to you in 2 particulars. Number 1, labor to recover others, even all that were ever distinguished and called by the name of the Lord, from their late fearful return into sinful compliances with the enemies of God and the nation. I don't speak of men's persons, but of their ways. For 3 years this people have been eminently sick of the folly of backsliding, and without some special cordial, are like to perish in it, as far as I know. Look upon the estate of this people as they were differenced 7 years ago, so for some continuance, and as they are now, and you shall find in how many things we have returned to others, and not one instance to be given of their return to us. That this may be clear, take some particulars. 1, in words and expressions. Turn them over, and you may find what is in the whole heart. Out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. Now is it not the language? Are not those very expressions which fill the mouths of the common adversaries only, throwing also terms of reproach to the tongues of men that suffered sometimes under them, and counted it their honor so to do? Hence that common exprobration, a parliament of saints, an army of saints, and such like derisions of God's ways. Now plentiful with them, who sat sometimes and took sweet counsel with us. Ah, had it not been more for the honor of God that we had kept our station until others had come to us, so to have exalted the name and profession of the gospel, than that we should so return to them as to join with them in making the paths of Christ a reproach. Had it not been better for us with Judah to continue ruling with God, and to be faithful with the saints, Hosea 11 verse 12, than to stand in the congregation of the mockers and to sit in the seat of the scornful? What shall we say when the saints of God are as signs and wonders to be spoken against in Israel? Isaiah 8 verse 18. Oh, that men would remember how they have left their first station, when they themselves use those reproaches to others, which for the same cause themselves formerly bear with comfort. It is bitterness to consider how the gospel is scandalized by this woeful return of ministers and people, by casting scriptural expressions by way of scorn on those with whom they were sometimes in the like kind companions of contempt. Surely in this we are returned to them, and not they to us. Number 2, in actions, and those of religion. Not only in opinion, but in practice also are we here under a vile return. We have become the lions, and the very same thoughts are entertained by us against others, as were exercised towards ourselves. Are not others as unworthy to live upon their native soil in our judgments as we ourselves in the judgments of them formerly over us? Are not groans for liberty by the warmth of favor in a few years hatched to attempts for tyranny, and for practice what hold has former superstition, and observing days and times laid upon many of the people again? Witness the late solemn superstition and many things of the like nature. Number 2, for civil things. The closing of so many formerly otherwise engaged with the adverse party in the late rebellion, with the lukewarm deportment of others at the same time, is a sufficient demonstration of it. And may not the Lord justly complain of all this? What iniquity have you seen in me, or my ways, that you are gone far from me, and have walked after vanity, and are become vain? Jeremiah 2:5. Why have you changed your glory for that which does not profit? Verse 11. Have I been a dry heath or a barren wilderness to you? Oh, that men should find no more sweetness in following a lamb under wonderful protections, but they should thus turn aside into every wilderness. What indignity is this to the ways of God? I could give you many reasons of it, but I have done what I intended. A little hinted that we are a returning people, so that you might be exhorted to help for a recovery. And how shall that be? Number 2, by your own keeping close to the paths of righteousness. If you do not return, others will look about it again. This breach, this evil is of you. Within your own walls was the fountain of our backsliding. Would you be the repairers of breaches, the restorers of paths for men to walk in? Then do these 2 things. 1, turn not to the ways of such as the Lord has blasted under your eyes. These may be referred to 3 heads: oppression, self-seeking, contrivances for persecution. Number 2, don't return to the open enemies of our peace. I could here enlarge myself to support your spirits in the work mentioned in Job 29:14 and 15, but I must go on to the following part of my text, and therefore I pass from the direction given to the supportment and assistance promise. Will make you to this people a brazen and a fenced wall. An implied objection which a prophet might put in upon his charge to keep so close to the rule of righteousness is here removed. If I must thus abide by it, to execute whatsoever the Lord calls me out to, not shrinking nor staggering at the greatest undertakings, what will become of me in this issue? Will it not be destructive to stand out against the confirmed people? No, saith the Lord, it shall not be. I will make thee, and so on. Observation. God will certainly give prevailing strength and unconquerable defense to persons constantly discharging the duties of righteousness, especially when undertaken in times of difficulty and opposition. The like engagement to this you have made to Ezekiel chapter 3, 8 and 9. Neither was it so to the prophets alone, but to magistrates also. Joshua undertook the regency of Israel in a difficult time. He takes off his fear and diffidence with this very encouragement. Joshua 1:5. He says he will make them a wall, the best defense against opposition, and that not a weak tottering wall that might easily be cast down, but a brazen wall that must needs be impregnable. What engines can possibly prevail against a wall of brass? And to make it more secure, this brazen wall shall be fenced with all the manner of fortifications and ammunition, so that the veriest coward in the world, being behind such a wall, may, without dread or terror, apply himself to that which he finds to do. God will so secure the instruments of his glory against a backsliding people, in holding up the ways of his truth and righteousness, that all attempts against them shall be vain, and the most timorous spirit may be secure, provided he go not out of the Lord's way. For if they be found beyond the line, the brazen wall, they may easily be surprised. And indeed, who but a fool would run from the shelter of a brazen wall to hide himself in a little stubble? And yet so do all who run to their own wisdom from the most hazardous engagement that any of the ways of God can possibly lead them to. It is a sure word and forever to be rested upon, which the Lord gives in to Asa, 2 Chronicles 15:2. The Lord is with you while you be with him. An unbiased magistracy shall never lack God's continued presence. Very Jeroboam himself receives a promise, upon condition of close walking with God and righteous administrations, of having a house built like him, like the house of David, 1 Kings 11:38. What a wall was God to Moses in that great undertaking of being instrumental for the deliverance of Israel from a bondage and slavery of 400 years' continuance. Pharaoh was against him, whom he had deprived of his sovereignty and dominion over the people. And what a provocation the depriving of sovereignty is to potentates needs no demonstration. To the corruption of nature which inclines to heights and exaltations, in imitation of the fountain whence it flows, they have also the corruption of state and condition, which is always inclined to absoluteness and tyranny. All Egypt was against him, as being by him visibly destroyed, wasted, spoiled, robbed, and at length smitten in the apple of the eye, by the loss of their firstborn. And if this be not enough, that the king and people whom he opposed were his enemies, the very people for whose sakes he set himself to oppose the others, they also rise up against him, yea, seek to destroy him. One time they appealed to God for justice against him, Exodus 5:21, the Lord look upon you and judge. They appealed to the righteous God to witness that he had not fulfilled what he promised them, to wit liberty, safety, and freedom from oppression, but that rather by his means their burdens were increased. And in this they were so confident, like some amongst us, that they appealed to God for the equity of their complaints. Afterward being reduced to a strait, such as they could not see how possibly they should be extricated from, without utter ruin, like our present condition in the apprehension of some, they cry out upon him for the whole design of bringing them into the wilderness, and affirm positively that though they had perished in their former slavery, it had been better for them than to have followed him in this new and dangerous engagement, Exodus 14:11 and 12. That generation, as John Calvin observes, so inured to bondage that they were altogether unfit to bear with the workings and pangs of their approaching liberty. Afterward, do they lack drink? Moses is the cause. Do they lack meat? This Moses would starve them, Exodus 15:24. Exodus 16:7. He cannot let them alone by the flesh pots of Egypt. For this they are ready to stone him, Exodus 17:3. At this day have we too much rain or too short a harvest? It is laid on the shoulders of the present government. It was no otherwise of old. At length, this people came to that height, as being frightened by the opposition they heard of and framed to themselves in that place where Moses would carry them. They presently enter into a conspiracy and revolt, consulting to cast off his government and choose new commanders, and with a violent hand to return to their former condition, Numbers 14:4, an attempt as frequent as fruitless among ourselves. When this would not do, at length upon the occasion of taking off Korah and his company, they assemble themselves together and lay not imprisonment, but murder to his charge, and that of the people of the Lord. Numbers 16:41. Now what was the issue of all those oppositions? What effect had they? How did the power of Pharaoh, the revenge of Egypt, the backsliding of Israel prevail? Why, God made this one Moses a fenced, brazen wall to them all. He was never in the least measure prevailed against. So long as he was with God, God was with him, no matter who was against him.